The thing about moments that change everything is that they never announce themselves. You're just standing there, doing what you always do, breathing the same air you've breathed 1,000 times before, and then the sky cracks open like old bone, and nothing is ever the same again. I was standing on the eastern observation platform of Station Valdres when it happened. Just me and my coffee, synthetic, terrible, the kind that tastes like someone described real coffee to a machine that had never actually smelled one, and the endless dark of space stretching out in every direction like a wound that never closed. My name is Sergeant Davin Roque. I'm human, 41 years old, third-generation coalition serviceman, 17 years in the Outer Rim Patrol. I've seen things that would make most people stare at the ceiling for 3 weeks without blinking. I've watched colony ships burn from the inside out. I've carried men twice my size through tunnels that wanted to collapse and swallow us whole. I've sat with dying alien soldiers and held hands with creatures that didn't even have hands, not technically, just appendages that gripped like they meant it. I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. That night, and I still call it night even though there's no sun in the outer rim, just degrees of darkness, that night was the beginning of something I still can't fully explain, not because the facts aren't clear. They are now. The battle reports, the casualty numbers, the after-action reviews, it's all there in the Coalition archives, filed under Classification 7, cross-referenced under human behavioral anomalies during crisis events. But the feeling of it, the smell of it, the sound of that army arriving and the sound of what stopped them, that part I can only tell you the way I lived it. So let me start from the beginning. Station Valdres sat at the intersection of 3 trade corridors in the Outer Rim, a massive installation, roughly the size of a small moon if you counted the docking rings and the external cargo platforms. It wasn't a military station, not exactly. It was what the Coalition called a mixed-use hub, which meant it was part trading post, part refueling depot, part refugee processing center, and part military checkpoint. About 60,000 beings lived and worked there permanently. On any given transit cycle, another 20 to 30,000 were passing through. Humans were maybe 12% of the permanent population. The rest were Coalition species. Velhari with their 4 arms and their tendency to speak in overlapping sentences, Drethi who communicated partly through subsonic vibration, and partly through a sign language so complex it took humans years to learn even the basics, Sunvari whose bodies generated their own bioluminescence, so they walked around the corridors glowing softly like lanterns, dozens of other species in smaller numbers. And then there were the Nachari. The Nachari were the reason I'm still not entirely sure how to tell this story without sounding like I'm making it up. They were ancient. That's the first thing you needed to understand about them. Not ancient the way the Velhari were ancient, with their long oral histories and their carefully preserved cultural artifacts. The Nachari were ancient the way geological formations were ancient, the way canyons were ancient, carved by time so slowly that the carving itself became the story. They had lived in the Outer Rim long before the Coalition existed, long before most of the Coalition species had developed interstellar travel. The earliest records of them in the xenoarchaeological databases went back 11,000 years, and even those records were fragmentary, incomplete, like trying to understand an ocean by studying a single cup of water. Their biology was complicated. They didn't process light the way most species did. They didn't eat the way most species did. They had a circulatory system, yes, but what moved through it wasn't blood in any conventional sense. It was something the xenobiologists called vitalic fluid, which sounded like science and felt like a polite way of avoiding what it actually was. The Nachari fed on bioelectric energy, the electromagnetic signatures produced by living nervous systems. They could do this at range, a few meters at most, and they didn't harm their sources, not unless they wanted to. Most of the time it was barely noticeable, a slight warmth, a faint tingling, like static electricity passing over your skin. But they could do more than that, if the situation demanded it. I knew one Nachari, had known her for 3 years by the time all of this happened. Her name was Saravith. And if there's one thing I need you to understand before I get to the part where the sky broke open, it's that Saravith was not what most people assumed when they met her. She was the station's senior diplomatic liaison officially. In practice, she was the reason half the trade agreements on Valdris hadn't collapsed into armed disputes. She understood people, all kinds of people, every species, every temperament, with a precision that went beyond training or experience. It was instinct, the deep kind that comes from living long enough to see every pattern repeat itself a dozen times. The Nachari lived a long time. I once asked her, cautiously, how old she was. She'd looked at me with those eyes, deep amber, almost luminescent in dim light, and said, very quietly, old enough that the question feels like asking how many grains of sand are on a beach. She had dark hair, nearly black, that she kept pulled back when she was working. Her skin was pale the way marble was pale, not sick pale, not washed out, but genuinely white, with a faint blue undertone in the veins at her wrists and temples. She was tall, taller than me, and I'm 6 feet even. She moved with the kind of economy that came from knowing exactly what her body could do and never needing to perform it. She was, in the categorical terminology of the Coalition's xenobiology departments, a Nachari primary line female of senior status. In the terminology of the human cultural traditions, she'd studied with an almost academic fascination, and she had studied them obsessively, going back centuries. She was a vampire princess. Not a princess in the political sense, though there was some complex Nachari hierarchy that I never fully understood. Princess in the sense that she carried herself like something that couldn't be diminished, like something that had learned over a very long time exactly what it was and had no remaining anxiety about it. She found it amusing when I explained the human folklore about her kind, the garlic, the wooden stakes, the inability to cross running water. Humans, she'd said once, have an extraordinary talent for taking something true and surrounding it with so much invented fear that the truth becomes almost impossible to find. I'd asked her what the truth was. She'd smiled that careful Nachari smile, the one that didn't show teeth, and said, that we are very old and very patient, and we remember things that everyone else has forgotten. Now let me tell you about Krampus. Not the old human folklore, not the Christmas demon with the chains and the bundle of birch switches. That figure was, as far as anyone could trace, a corrupted memory, a distant cultural echo of something real that had been translated through centuries of human storytelling into something manageable, something that fit into a seasonal tradition. The real Krampus was a military commander. His actual designation in the Coalition Threat Registry was Krampus Vel, which in the Drethai language approximately translated to the consuming dark that moves with intent. The Coalition intelligence community had shortened it to Krampus because someone in the naming division had a sense of dark humor and because it stuck. He was Volkai, an alien species that had never joined the Coalition, had never negotiated with the Coalition, had in fact spent several centuries conducting a slow and methodical war of attrition against Coalition infrastructure in the Outer Rim. The Volkai were large, 8 feet minimum, broad-shouldered, with a physical structure that looked like someone had designed a predator and then given it tactical intelligence and a grudge. Their skin was dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Their eyes were deep-set, pale, almost white. They had no ears in the conventional sense, just pressure-sensitive membranes along their jaw and neck that picked up vibrations across a frequency range humans couldn't even hear. Krampus was their supreme military strategist, 300 years old, give or take. The kind of commander who didn't win battles through overwhelming force, though he had that too. He won them by understanding exactly what his enemies valued and then threatening precisely that. The coalition had been trying to neutralize him for 40 years. 40 years. Every time they got close, he dissolved. Every time they thought they'd cornered him, he'd already been somewhere else for 2 weeks. He operated through layers of command structure so deep and so compartmentalized that capturing or eliminating any individual piece of it barely slowed anything down. He had also, in those 40 years, assembled what the intelligence community called the Dark Army. That name wasn't metaphorical. The Dark Army was literally dark. Krampus recruited species and factions that operated in low-light, nocturnal, and radiation-heavy environments, species that the Coalition's standard scanning equipment struggled with, species whose biology made them resistant to conventional weapons in various ways. He'd built, over 4 decades, a fighting force specifically designed to be difficult to detect and difficult to stop. And 3 months ago, someone in Coalition intelligence had made a critical error. I still don't know who. The investigation is ongoing. Maybe I'll never know. But someone had leaked the location of the Valdris defensive grid's primary power relay, the node that, if it went offline, would drop shields across the entire eastern sector of the station, the sector that contained the refugee processing centers, the civilian residential zones, the medical facilities. 60,000 people, most of them not soldiers. Krampus had known for 3 months. He'd spent those 3 months moving his Dark Army into position in the debris fields around the Valdris system, slowly, in small groups, using the electromagnetic interference from the system's twin pulsars as cover for their signatures. We didn't know any of this until the sky broke open. I was on the observation platform at 300 station time when the first alerts hit. My comm unit buzzed, then screamed, then went briefly silent in the way that comm units did when they were trying to process too much signal at once. I looked at the readout and saw the words Eastern Grid offline and felt my coffee, terrible, synthetic, the worst coffee in 3 solar systems, go cold in my hand. Then I looked up through the reinforced transparasteel of the observation dome, out into the debris field, and I saw them. They were emerging from the debris field the way smoke emerged from embers, slowly at first, then all at once. Ships of a dozen different designs, dark-hulled, running minimal light signatures, moving in a formation so disciplined it looked like a single organism. Hundreds of ships, then more than hundreds. My comm screamed again. Station Commander Verk, Velhari, 4 arms, 3 years from retirement, voice absolutely level in the way voices got when the training took over completely. All personnel, battle stations. This is not a drill. Eastern Grid is down. Estimated hostile contact in 12 minutes. All non-combat personnel to emergency shelters. Military and security, you have your assignments. Move. 12 minutes. I was already moving. The next 4 hours were the worst of my life. I say that as a man who has had several genuinely terrible sequences of hours to compare against. The Dark Army came in waves. That was Krampus's signature, not a single overwhelming assault, but waves, each one timed to arrive just as the defenders thought they'd managed to stabilize. The first wave hit the docking rings and the external cargo platforms. The second wave pushed into the lower corridors. The third wave went for the power systems. We held barely. I commanded a mixed unit, 4 humans, 7 Velhari, 2 Drethi, and a Sunvari medic named Teth whose bioluminescence kept flickering when she was stressed, which meant we always had a visual indicator of exactly how bad things were getting. When Teth went dim, things were manageable. When Teth went almost dark, we had maybe 30 seconds to figure out what was wrong. Teth was almost dark for most of those 4 hours. We held corridor section J7 through the first 2 waves. Lost one of my humans. A young corporal named Bresson who'd been on Valdris for 6 months and had been planning to transfer to a station closer to his home system at the end of the cycle, lost one of the Velhari. The others were wounded in varying degrees. By the time the fourth wave was forming in the docking rings, our ammunition was down to 30%. Our heavy weapons were down to one functional unit. 2 of my soldiers were combat ineffective from wounds, propped against the corridor wall and doing what they could with sidearms. And the fourth wave was bigger than the others. I could hear it before I could see it, the specific quality of sound that a lot of heavy bodies in combat equipment made moving through metal corridors, a vibration that you felt in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. I looked at what I had. I looked at what was coming. I clicked my comm. Command, this is Sergeant Roke at J7. We cannot hold this section against a fourth wave with current resources. Requesting immediate support or permission to fall back to G sector. Static, then Commander Verk's voice, and for the first time it wasn't level. Roke, we have nothing to send you. Every unit is engaged. If J7 falls, they have a corridor to the power relay. You understand what that means? I understood what that meant. If the power relay went down, the shields didn't just drop over the eastern sector. They dropped everywhere. Emergency power would maintain life support and basic structural integrity, but the weapons systems, the defensive batteries, everything that was keeping the remaining Dark Army ships from docking freely, all of it would go dark. 60,000 people. Understood, I said. I looked at my unit, the ones who could still fight. The ones who were watching me with the specific kind of attention that soldiers give a commander when they've figured out that the math doesn't work, and they're waiting to see what he does with that information. We hold, I said. Whatever comes, we hold. The fourth wave hit us 5 minutes later. It was bad. There is a limit to how much detail I can provide without this becoming something other than a story, without it becoming a catalog of violence that serves no purpose. So I'll tell you this. We held. For longer than we should have been able to. The Drethi fought with the kind of focused, contained ferocity that their species brought to close-quarters combat, which was extraordinary. The Velhari used their 4 arms in ways that made them worth 2 soldiers each. My remaining humans, 2 of them, myself included, fell back on the kind of stubbornness that humans sometimes mistake for courage, but which is actually just an inability to accept the arithmetic when the arithmetic says we're done. We held, and then we started to lose. The line broke at the corridor junction. 2 Volkai soldiers, massive, dark, moving with that terrible disciplined efficiency, pushed through the gap, and there was nothing between them and the power relay door except 30 meters of empty corridor and whatever I had left to give. I put myself in the corridor. Just me. The others were holding what remained of the junction. It was just me and 30 meters of metal flooring and 2 Volkai soldiers who were each approximately the size of a small vehicle and who had been fighting and winning battles since before I was born. I had my rifle and a sidearm and a combat knife and 17 years of experience and the particular human tendency to keep trying things even when the situation has officially become impossible. The Volkai looked at me. I looked at them. There was a moment, one of those moments that stretches out, that the brain records in extraordinary detail because it has correctly assessed the situation as this might be the last thing you see, where we all just existed together in that corridor, 3 soldiers on opposite sides of a war, assessing each other. Then one of them spoke. Deep, resonant, the subsonic frequencies I couldn't hear but could feel in my chest. The translator on my unit rendered it in flat, affectless text. Move, small soft thing, we do not need your death, only the relay. I said out loud in the empty corridor, no. It was not a brilliant response. It was not strategic. It was not the calculated tactical choice of an experienced combat veteran. It was just the only word that was true, so it was the only word I had. The Volkai moved. I want to be honest here about what would have happened next, if things had followed the natural order of the universe. I would have fought for maybe 15 seconds, 20 if I was lucky, which I generally am in small ways, not big ones. I would have injured one of them maybe, because I'm good at this, and because I had nothing to lose, so I had nothing to hold back. And then I would have been done, and the relay would have gone down, and 60,000 people would have faced whatever Krampus had planned next. That's what would have happened. What actually happened was that the corridor lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered, went completely, absolutely black in the space between one moment and the next, and then in that darkness something moved. Not the Volkai, they were still. I could feel that much. The pressure-sensitive membranes along their jaws would be working overtime, trying to parse the sudden absence of light, reorienting. Something else moved. It moved through the darkness the way darkness moved through darkness, not creating absence, being absence, flowing through it like water finding the path of least resistance. I couldn't see it. I could feel it. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. A sensation on the skin of my forearms that I recognized, had felt before in small doses, bioelectric sensitivity, the kind the Nachari produced when they were not feeding exactly. The word I always thought of was present, when a Nachari was fully, completely, deliberately present in a space. Then there was light. Not corridor light, not any kind of artificial light. Two sources, amber, moving, and I understood with a lurch of disorientation that the light was coming from eyes. Sarevith's eyes. She was between me and the Volkai. I don't know when she'd gotten there. I don't know how. Nachari moved in ways that didn't always seem consistent with physics as I understood it. Another thing, the xenobiologists had a lot of careful, technical language for that, mostly translated to, we don't entirely know how they do this. She was taller than I remembered, or she seemed taller. There was something different about the way she was holding herself, something that I struggled to identify for a moment before I recognized it. She was carrying herself without restraint for the first time since I'd known her. Every other time I'd seen her, there was something held back, something leashed and controlled and carefully managed. She moved through the station like a person, navigating a space that was slightly too small for what she actually was. Right now she wasn't navigating anything. She was filling the corridor. The Volkai stopped. The one who had spoken said something. The translator gave me, "Nochari, this is not your conflict." Sarevith said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely without warmth, "You are standing between me and someone under my protection. It is precisely my conflict." There was a pause. The quality of it was interesting, not the pause of uncertainty, but the pause of recalculation. The Volkai were old soldiers. They knew what they were looking at. "Move," Sarevith said, "or don't." The second option had an implied consequence that she didn't need to articulate. One of the Volkai said something that the translator didn't catch, too much subsonic content probably. The other one answered, a short exchange. Then one of them took a step forward. Sarevith moved. I have seen a lot of combat. I have trained in several different fighting disciplines. I have watched footage of the best human fighters in the coalition military doing things with their bodies that seem to push against the edges of what's physically possible. What Sarevith did in the next 45 seconds did not resemble any of that. It was not fighting the way I understood fighting. It was something older than fighting, something that didn't have a proper name in any language I knew. The Volkai were large, armored, experienced, and extraordinarily dangerous. She moved through them the way weather moved, not being stopped by things so much as deciding where to be in relation to them, so that their force and her position were never in direct conflict. She didn't hurt them. I should be clear about that. It would be wrong to say she fought them and won in the conventional sense. What she did was something more like, she unmade their confidence. She moved around and through their defenses with such complete ease that they stopped being offensive and became reactive, trying to track her, trying to anticipate her, and finding that their predictive models had nothing to work with. The Volkai fought the universe they expected. She gave them one they couldn't expect. 30 seconds in, both soldiers were on the floor, not dead. Not even badly hurt, just stopped. There was a particular thing she could do with the bioelectric contact, I found out later, that essentially told the nervous system stop in a language too fundamental for conscious resistance to work against. Not harmful, just pause. Like hitting a standby switch on something that had been going at full power. She stood over them in the darkness, those amber eyes the only light, and she wasn't even breathing harder than usual. She turned and looked at me. "Are you hurt?" I ran a quick assessment. Some bruising from the earlier waves. A cut on my left arm I hadn't had time to register. Nothing structural. "No," I said. "How did you?" "Later," she said. "There are more of them at the junction and your unit needs support." She was right. I could hear it. The sounds of the junction fight were getting worse. "The relay," I said. "Protected," she said. "For now, come." Here is where I have to tell you about the other part of this. About the rider. I didn't see him until we got back to the junction, and even then I almost missed him in the chaos. He was human, which meant he was, by the standards of most of the species fighting in that corridor, relatively unremarkable in scale. Medium height lean, the particular kind of lean that came from long travel and not enough consistent meals. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, a scar across his chin that disappeared into the collar of his jacket. The jacket was the thing. I'd never seen anything quite like it. Not armor, exactly. More like armor had been incorporated into something that started its life as a piece of clothing. Layered panels of a material I didn't recognize, dull matte finish, fitted close to the body, but with obvious articulation at the joints. On the back, spreading from shoulder to shoulder, a design in deep red against the dark material that I recognized after a moment's disorientation as wings. Not decorative wings. Stylized, compressed, but undeniably functional in their inspiration. He was fighting. More specifically, he was fighting with a weapon I didn't recognize, a staff, roughly 2 meters, that he was using in a way that suggested he'd trained with it long enough that the thinking part of fighting had been replaced entirely by reflex. He moved efficiently, without wasted motion, and he was very effective at creating space, at keeping multiple opponents at the distances where his weapon worked best. He was also, I noticed, fighting back-to-back with one of my Velhari soldiers, which he'd apparently established as an arrangement in the 90 seconds since I'd lost track of the junction. My Velhari, Sergeant Krath. 4 arms going in 4 directions simultaneously, and this stranger with his staff. And between them they were holding the junction in a way that my unit alone hadn't managed. I got there, Sarevith at my back, and the dynamics shifted again. The Volkai at the junction, there were 6 of them, in addition to the various other Dark Army soldiers pressing from the corridor entrance, registered Sarevith the same way the others had. That recalculation, that pause. Sarevith didn't give them time to finish calculating. She went into the junction the same way she'd gone into the corridor, and the effect was the same, and the Volkai stopped being a coordinated attacking force and became something more confused and reactive. Into that confusion, the rest of us, my unit, the stranger with the staff, pushed hard, and something that had been about to break started, improbably, to stabilize. The 5th wave never formed. I found out later, much later in the debrief, what had happened at the strategic level while my unit was fighting for the relay corridor. The Dark Army's command structure had been operating on a specific timeline. Krampus's plan depended on each wave hitting at precise intervals, maintaining pressure, not giving the station's defenders time to consolidate. What Sarevith had done, what she'd been doing, I learned, in the 20 minutes before she arrived at my corridor, was move through the Dark Army's forward positions with the particular kind of focused disruption that a Nachari of her experience could produce when operating without restraint. She hadn't fought their army. She hadn't needed to. She'd targeted the nerve junctions of their command and coordination structure, the communications nodes, the senior officers in each wave formation, and she'd created just enough disruption, just enough delay, that the fifth wave's timing slipped. And when the fifth wave's timing slipped, the station's defensive batteries, back online after an engineering team had managed a heroic repair on the eastern grid in conditions I don't want to think too hard about, had a window. They used it. The Dark Army's formation in the debris field, which had been moving with such disciplined precision, encountered a coordinated defensive fire for the first time in the engagement. Valdra Station wasn't a military installation, but it wasn't defenseless either, and when the batteries were all functional and coordinated, and given a window where the enemy formation had a slight gap in its movement discipline, Krampus lost 40% of his fleet in 11 minutes. The rest withdrew. The cleanup took days, the debrief took longer. The after-action reviews, the casualty assessments, the structural damage reports, the diplomatic fallout, that process is still ongoing. But I'm telling you about a specific evening, 3 days after the battle, when Sarevith and I sat in the observation lounge on the station's northern ring, the part that hadn't been touched by the fighting, that still had its original lights and its original furniture, a little worn but intact, and I asked her the questions I'd been carrying for 72 hours. The stranger with the staff was there too. His name was Kale. He was from a human settlement in the deep outer rim, a generation ship community that had been traveling for so long that the original destination had become a myth. They weren't going anywhere anymore, just traveling, covering territory no one had mapped because their ancestors had been map makers by nature, and the instinct had persisted. He was Sarevith's rider. That was the word they used between themselves, though Sarevith had a longer explanation for it that she gave me carefully, watching my face to see how I'd receive it. The Nachari, she explained, had a tradition, ancient, going back further than the coalition, further than most of what currently existed in the outer rim, of choosing companions. Not servants, not subordinates. Companions in the deep sense. People who matched them, who moved through the world in complementary ways, who could go where the Nachari couldn't and see what the Nachari couldn't, and be the kind of presence in a situation that required a different kind of presence. You chose a human, I said. 3 times, she said. In 11,000 years, there have been other species, but 3 times humans. Why? She thought about this. Sarevith always thought before she answered questions that deserved thinking about. Because, she said finally, humans have a quality that most species develop and then moderate. You are unreasonable. In the technical sense, you do not consistently reason from available evidence to probable outcomes and then act accordingly. You do things that the evidence says are impossible, and sometimes the things happen anyway. Humans call this courage or stubbornness or faith, depending on the context. From the outside, it looks like a persistent refusal to accept the arithmetic. She glanced at me when she said that last part. I thought of the corridor and myself standing in it, and the word I'd said. It's dangerous, she added. Often it's fatal, but when it works, she paused. When it works, it changes the arithmetic, and that is worth something that I find difficult to calculate. Kale across the table was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she also picked me because I can cook. She can't. It's a significant practical advantage. Sarevith's expression shifted in the way Nachari expressions sometimes shifted, subtle, but visible if you knew what to look for. Something warm briefly, before the composure came back. He is also, she said, extremely difficult to kill, which is operationally relevant. I asked Kale how he'd gotten to Valdris, how they'd known. He told me. They'd been in the Velar sector, 2 transit corridors away, when the intelligence about Krampus's position started moving through the outer networks, not the official coalition channels. The unofficial ones, the ones that moved through trading posts and way station bars, and the kind of people who made their living knowing things before the authorities did. Sarevith had a network. She'd had it for a long time. It operated slowly, carefully, through contacts she'd maintained across decades. When the information about Valdris came through that network, she'd already been moving before the coalition had officially confirmed the threat. She didn't tell me we were going to a battle, Kale said, looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between accusation and affection. She told me we were delivering a cargo consignment. We were, Sarevith said. We also happened to arrive during an engagement. We arrived during an engagement because you planned it that way. The cargo consignment was genuine. Kale looked at me. In 11,000 years, he said, she has apparently never once said directly, Kale, I need you to come with me to a battle. It's always cargo consignments, or diplomatic meetings, or I thought we might stop at Valdris on the way. I did not want you to feel obligated, Sarevith said. I'm your rider, Kale said. Obligation is, he stopped, shook his head, smiled at the table. Obligation is the wrong word, you know that. Sarevith did not answer this, but her expression did something that I'd never seen it do in 3 years of working alongside her. Something unguarded. Something that belonged entirely to this person across the table, not to the diplomatic persona, not to the station liaison, not to anything she was in a professional capacity. I looked away. Some things weren't mine to see. Before I wrap up this first part, I want to tell you one more thing. Because this story has a lot of pieces, the battle, the political fallout, the investigation into the intelligence leak, the question of what Krampus does next, and I'll get to all of those. But there's something simpler I need to say first. In the days after the battle, when the casualty lists were compiled and the damage assessments were done, and the station was starting slowly to breathe again, there was a ceremony. The commander put together something appropriate to the scale of what had happened. Not a victory celebration, because the losses were too real for that. A remembrance, for the soldiers and civilians who hadn't made it through. Sarevith attended. That wasn't unusual. She was the senior diplomatic liaison. It was part of her function. She stood in the back, precise and composed and impeccably herself. Kale stood next to her. At some point during the proceedings, one of the Velhari officers was reading names, 63 names, and the room was very quiet. I glanced back at them. I don't know why. Just one of those involuntary things, the eye drawn by something peripheral. Kale had his hand around Sarevith's wrist, not holding her hand, just his fingers loosely around her wrist, where a pulse would be if she had one in the conventional sense. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking forward at the speaker at the names. But her head had tilted just slightly toward him, an inch, less than an inch. 63 names. The room breathed. And in the back, an ancient thing that had seen too much history, and the unreasonable human who had somehow ended up in the orbit of her extraordinary life, stood together in the specific silence that 2 people share when they have been through something that defies easy language. I turned back around. I keep thinking about what she said, about humans and the arithmetic. 17 years in service. I've done the math on impossible situations more times than I can count. Usually the math is right. Usually, if the math says it's over, it's over. But not always. That's the thing. That's the specific irritating, beautiful, inexplicable thing about humans that apparently an 11,000-year-old being found worth noting. Not always. Krampus's dark army outnumbered us, outgunned us. Had the element of surprise, a compromised grid, and a 40-year track record of winning against better prepared opponents. And they lost. Not because the math changed. Because two people arrived who didn't accept the math. One of them ancient, patient, operating from a depth of experience I can barely conceive of. One of them young, lean, traveling on a ship that hadn't had a permanent destination in generations. Both of them, in their different ways, choosing to be there. That's how the story goes, in my version of it. The sky broke open. The Dark Army came through. And they had won, they really had won, for exactly as long as it took two figures to arrive in the breach and say, in their different ways, the same word I'd said alone in that corridor. No. End of Part 1. Story continues across additional parts covering the investigation, the counterattack against Krampus's retreating fleet, the revelation of the intelligence leak, and the full history of Sarevith and Kale's partnership across 3 centuries of the Outer Rim. Part 2. What old soldiers remember. The thing about surviving something is that it doesn't end when the fighting stops. You'd think it would. Logically, that's how it should work. The threat passes, the adrenaline drains out, you take inventory of what's left, you move forward. Clean, simple, the kind of arc that makes sense on paper. But nothing about what happened on Valdris made sense on paper, and nothing about surviving it was clean or simple. The battle ended. The cleanup began. And somewhere in the middle of the cleanup, in the spaces between the technical work of repairing what was broken and accounting for what was lost, I started trying to understand what I'd actually witnessed. 3 days in, I requested a meeting with Sarevith. She said yes, which surprised me slightly. She was occupied. The diplomatic aftermath of an armed incursion involved cascading conversations with the Coalition Council, the Outer Rim Patrol Command, the various species-specific representatives whose constituents had been caught in the fighting. Her schedule should have had no room in it. She made room. We met in her quarters, which were in the northern ring and which I'd never been inside before. They were not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected. Clean, spare, very few personal objects visible. One wall was covered in what I initially thought were maps and then realized were something more complex, overlaid cartographies, multiple eras, showing the same regions of space across different centuries. The Outer Rim as it had looked 400 years ago, overlaid with what it looked like 200 years ago, overlaid with the current configuration. Changes highlighted in colors I didn't have names for. You've been watching this region for a long time, I said. Since before most of it had a name, she said. Sit down, Roke. You look like you haven't slept in 3 days. I haven't slept in 3 days. Then sit down, and we can do this without you swaying. I said. Kale was there too, in a chair near the wall of maps, doing something with a piece of equipment I didn't recognize, not a weapon, something more delicate. He nodded when I sat down. Easy, unguarded, the kind of greeting that meant you're welcome here. I want to understand the Volkai, I said. I want to understand Krampus specifically. The intelligence we had going into this was clearly inadequate, and I've been sitting with the afteraction and something keeps bothering me about his pattern. Sarevith settled into the chair across from me with the particular quality of stillness she could produce when she decided to be entirely present in a conversation. What bothers you? He retreated, I said. He lost 40% of his fleet, he retreated. That fits the pattern. Every time he gets hit hard, he withdraws, reconsolidates, reappears somewhere else. But the intelligence debrief keeps describing this as, I pulled up the report on my comm, found the phrase, standard Volkai strategic response to tactical reversal. And something about that doesn't sit right with me, because he's not a standard Volkai commander. He's been operating for 300 years. He's seen tactical reversals. He's absorbed them and kept going. So why does this one feel different? Sarevith looked at me for a moment with those amber eyes. How long have you been a soldier, Roke? 17 years. And in 17 years, What have you learned about commanding officers who have held power for a very long time? I thought about it. They develop a relationship with their own narrative. They start to understand themselves as the protagonist of a story they're telling. Yes. So when the story goes wrong, when the story goes wrong in ways that contradict the protagonist's self-understanding, she said, the response is not tactical, it's existential. Krampus has not simply lost a battle. He has been stopped, visibly, in front of his forces in what was supposed to be a decisive engagement by a station that should not have been able to stop him. And the mechanism of his stopping was, she paused. You, I said. Me, yes, and Kale, and your unit's refusal to yield a corridor that, statistically, should have been lost 20 minutes before I arrived. She folded her hands in her lap. He will not process this as a tactical reversal. He will process it as an affront, which means his next move will not be strategic. It will be personal. I felt something cold move through my chest. He'll come back. He'll come back, she confirmed. But not with the dark army and the debris field and the patient, methodical siege. That plan failed, and it failed in front of everyone. He will come back with something different, something that addresses specifically what stopped him. Which means he'll come back for you. He'll come back for me, she agreed. And for Kale, and probably peripherally for you. You stood in his path with no tactical reason to expect survival. To a Volkai strategist of his experience, that is not just resistance. It is an insult in the most fundamental sense of the word. It implies that he was not seen as genuinely threatening. I found him genuinely threatening, I said. I know, but you stood there anyway. She watched me. That is the part that will infuriate him. Kale had set down whatever he was working on and was listening. He said without looking up, "She's done this before. Talk to people about what Krampus is going to do next, what he's thinking, why he does things. For about 30 years. You've been watching him for 30 years, I asked Sarevith. 42, she said, since the first time I heard his name and identified the pattern. The Coalition has been trying to neutralize him for 40 years. I know. I've occasionally been involved in those efforts. She paused. Less occasionally than the Coalition is aware of, but that's a different conversation. Something clicked into place. You knew, I said. You knew about the threat to Valdris before the Coalition did, not just 3 days before. You've been watching him for 42 years. You've been watching his movements, his patterns. You knew he was building toward something in this sector. I had indicators, she said carefully. Sarevith. She looked at me with the expression that meant she was deciding how much to say. After a moment, I have been concerned about the Valdris sector for approximately 8 months. I positioned myself here 6 months ago, under the cover of a legitimate diplomatic posting, which was also genuinely useful and which I would have undertaken regardless. But yes, in part because I wanted to be close if something developed. I sat with that for a moment. And you didn't share this with Coalition Command because, she said, the last 3 times I have shared operational intelligence through official Coalition channels, the intelligence has been compromised before it could be acted upon. I do not know where the leak is. I have been trying to identify it for 18 months. I have not succeeded. And sharing intelligence through a compromised channel is not sharing intelligence. It is telling your enemy what you know. The cold in my chest intensified. The leak, I said slowly. The one that gave Krampus the location of the grid's power relay. That's the same leak. Almost certainly. You knew this was coming, and you couldn't warn anyone without the warning reaching Krampus first. It is a frustrating position, she said, with magnificent understatement. What are you doing about it? I'm sitting in this room talking to you, she said, which is the first step in what I believe to be a plan, if you're interested in hearing the rest of it. The plan took 3 hours to explain. I'm going to be honest, there were parts of it I didn't fully understand. because they relied on knowledge of Nachari network structures and coalition political dynamics that I didn't have. But the broad shape of it was this. The intelligence leak had to be somewhere in the chain between the senior coalition strategic command and the field commanders in the outer rim. It was too precise, too consistently damaging to be opportunistic. It was someone with sustained access to operational intelligence at a high level, who had been feeding it to Krampus for years. Saravith had narrowed the candidates down through a process she described as careful observation over a significant period of time, and which I suspected was somewhat more aggressive than that description implied, to 4 individuals. 2 were in the Outer Rim Patrol Command. 1 was in the Coalition Council's Strategic Advisory Committee. 1 was attached to the Xenodiplomacy Division. She could not prove which one without evidence she didn't yet have. The only way to get the evidence was to feed false intelligence through the chain in a way that was specific to each suspect, then watch to see which piece of false information Krampus acted on. It was a slow plan. Careful. It would take months, maybe longer, depending on how quickly Krampus moved on the false intelligence. And in the meantime, I said, Valdris is exposed. You said he'll come back personally. Yes. And you're proposing to be here when he does. Kale and I will be here, she said, if you'll have us. I looked at Kale, who was watching me with the quiet attention of someone who had been in enough situations to know that the question wasn't really directed at him. The question was whether I trusted her, and whether I thought her plan was worth the risk. You could leave, I said. You and Kale. If Krampus is coming for you personally, leaving would draw him away from the station. It would, she agreed. And then 60,000 people on Valdris would be without the only intelligence source that has accurately predicted his movements for 42 years, and without the only countermeasure that has demonstrably disrupted his operational structure. She paused. I considered it. Leaving seems simpler, but simple and right are not always the same. I looked at the map wall, the outer rim across centuries, change marked in colors without names. Stay, I said. Both of you. The weeks that followed were quiet, in the way that quiet feels when you know it's provisional. When you know that the stillness is not peace but preparation, on both sides of the equation. Valdris repaired. The Eastern Grid came back fully online within 2 weeks. The engineering team, who had done the repair under fire, received commendations that I personally thought didn't begin to cover what they'd actually accomplished. The docking rings were restored. The cargo platforms reopened. The station began to breathe normally again. The refugee processing centers were where you could feel it most, strangely. The intake numbers had spiked dramatically in the days after the battle, people who'd been passing through and decided not to leave, people from nearby settlements who'd been rattled by the news of the incursion and wanted to be somewhere with more infrastructure around them. The centers were running at double capacity. The staff were exhausted in the particular way that people who were doing necessary work in impossible conditions were exhausted, not defeated, just ground down, running on a combination of professionalism and the specific satisfaction of doing something that mattered. I spent time there when I wasn't on duty, helping where I could. Mostly just being an additional body that could move things, assist people through the intake process, translate when my Drethai was good enough. It mostly wasn't, but the Drethai were patient. Kale came with me sometimes. He was good at it in ways I hadn't expected, easy with strangers, adaptable, able to shift register and approach depending on who he was talking to. He'd clearly spent a lot of time moving through communities that weren't his own, navigating welcome and suspicion in equal measure, finding the specific combination of presence and deference that made people feel met rather than managed. Long practice, he said once when I mentioned it. Being a writer. Being a stranger, he said. Being the human in the room who arrived with the Nachari. You learn to either be very small or be very real. Small doesn't work long term. I thought about that. You don't find it. I tried to figure out how to ask what I was trying to ask. She's been doing this for 11,000 years. You've been, how old are you? 38, he said. 38. She's been doing this for 11,000 years, and you've been her writer for how long? 7 years, he said. 7 years. Does that feel? I still couldn't get to the thing I was actually asking. He was quiet for a moment. We were walking one of the station's secondary corridors between the processing center and the southern residential ring. You want to ask how it feels to be with someone who is going to outlive you by 10,000 years. Yes, I said. He didn't answer immediately. We walked. Around us, the station did its ordinary things. Cargo bots moved. Speakers called transit updates in 4 languages. A pair of Sunvari children in their parents' lightwake ran past us chasing something I couldn't see. There's an Achari concept, he said finally. I can't say the word properly. The phonetics are outside my range, but it translates roughly as the significance of a limited view. The idea being that a being who lives very long and a being who lives briefly are not looking at the same thing, even when they're looking at the same thing. The brief one sees it completely, the whole arc, the whole shape, beginning and middle and end, all at once, because the timeline is comprehensible. The long one sees detail, continuity, context, but the shape is lost in the scale. Neither view is complete. Both are necessary. She told you that. She showed me, he said. Early on when I was working through the same question you're asking. She took me to a place in the deep outer rim where a star had died a long time ago and there was a nebula. And she said you can see what this was. I was here when it happened and I can tell you the history, but I cannot see it the way you see it because for you it has a shape, an ending that defines the whole thing. For me it is still ongoing, still part of something larger. We need both of those eyes. I thought about this for a long time. Does that make it better? I asked, though the eventually of it. He smiled. Not a happy smile, an honest one. Some days more than others, he said. Today it makes it better. Ask me again on a different day. 43 days after the battle. I was in the Security Operations Center, mid-shift, routine by that point. The routine had become almost comfortable, the particular rhythm of a station that had been through something and was rebuilding its ordinary relationship with time, when the long-range sensors registered something at the edge of the system. Small single signal, moving fast. Not a fleet, not a formation, one ship. My section lead, a Velhari named Pearce with 25 years of experience reading signals, stared at her display for a moment and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "That's a Volkai personal transport." I was on the comm to Sarevith before the sentence was finished. Sarevith answered immediately. She'd been awake. I don't know when she slept or whether she slept in any way I'd recognize. Her voice was completely steady. "I see it," she said. 47 minutes at current speed. "It's one ship," I said. "Why would he come alone?" "He isn't alone," she said. "He never is, but this isn't a military engagement. This is," she paused, a pause that meant she was translating something into terms I'd understand. "This is a conversation he wants to have." A conversation. An attempt to establish the terms of whatever comes next. He wants to look at what stopped him. He wants to understand it on his own terms, not through reports and battle data. Another pause. He wants to look at me. "And we're going to let him dock." "No," she said. "We're going to meet him at the perimeter. Kale and he's coming for a conversation with specific people. We shouldn't involve the station in that conversation." Everything in my training said this was a bad idea. Everything in 17 years of operational judgment said, you don't meet an enemy commander at the perimeter in a personal transport. You engage through proper channels with appropriate force backing you up. Everything in 17 years of operational judgment also said, this woman has been right about Krampus for 42 years. Listen to her. I'm coming with you, I said. A pause. You weren't invited, she said. I wasn't invited to the corridor either, I said. I seemed to be persistent. Another pause, longer. 47 minutes, she said. Docking Bay 14. I have to describe Krampus properly, because the way I'd pictured him from the threat registries didn't do justice to what he actually was. We met him at the perimeter, a neutral point in space between the station and the incoming transport, in a coalition diplomatic shuttle that could sustain itself indefinitely in hard vacuum, and was equipped with a docking collar that allowed for pressurized connections between ships. A standard meeting arrangement for negotiations in space. He came aboard with 2 guards who were each approximately the size of the doors they walked through, and then himself. Krampus was 300 years old, and he looked like 300 years of winning felt. Large even for a Vaukai, easily 9 feet, broader than a doorway, moving with the weight of someone who had long since stopped needing to be intimidating because he simply was. His skin was the deep, light-absorbing dark of his species, and his pale eyes moved over the 3 of us with the deliberate economy of a predator that was not hunting, but was always ready to hunt. He looked at me first, then at Kale, then at Saravath. He stayed on Saravath for a long moment. Then he spoke directly, in coalition standard, not through a translator, which meant he'd learned it specifically and deliberately. His voice was deep enough that the subsonic content of it registered physically, a faint pressure against the chest. Nachari, he said, I have known of you for 20 years. I have known of you for 42, Saravath said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. You have been watching me. Carefully. And yet you never moved against me. Why 20 years of knowledge? Coalition intelligence would have paid well. I don't sell intelligence, she said. I use it. I waited until the moment it was needed. And you decided Valdris was that moment. Yes. He looked at her with those pale eyes for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. You cost me significantly. Yes. Why Valdris? There are larger stations, more valuable targets. Why was this worth your intervention? Because 60,000 people live there, she said. And because the moment that you take stations like Valdris without consequence is the moment the outer rim stops being somewhere people can live. People, he said, the word in his mouth had a particular weight. Your people, or, he glanced at me at Kale. Their people. All of them, she said, all the kinds there are. Krampus made a sound I didn't have a translation for. Not a word. Something older than words, an acknowledgement maybe. The sound of an entity that had been alive long enough to recognize something in another entity that had also been alive long enough. Nachari, he said, what do you want? From this conversation? From me? What is the purpose of meeting me here rather than sending coalition forces to detain my ship? Saravath looked at him steadily. I want you to understand something. Tell me. You are a brilliant strategist, she said. 3 centuries of success in the outer rim. You have built something extraordinary. I have watched you build it. And you have built it on a foundation of selective pressure. You push where the coalition doesn't push back. You take what the coalition has decided isn't worth defending. You move through the gaps between what matters and what doesn't matter to them. Krampus was very still. Valdris was a gap, she continued. It should have been a gap. 60,000 civilians, mixed species, a trading hub with a compromised grid by your own strategic logic. It was exactly the kind of target that the coalition would retroactively acknowledge losing without mounting a defense that could stop you. She paused. That logic was correct. The coalition could not have stopped you. And yet, she said, there are things in this universe that are not the coalition. There are things that have been here longer, that do not operate on the coalition's logic, and that care about different things. I am one of them. And I need you to understand that while I am in the outer rim, the gap you're looking for does not exist. Not here. Silence. The shuttle hummed around us. Beyond the hull, space was absolutely quiet in the way it always was. A warning, Krampus said finally. Information, she said. What you do with it is your own calculation. He looked at her, at Kale, at me, and his gaze on me had a different quality, the particular assessment I'd felt in corridors right before things became violent, and I kept my face neutral and my hands loose and held his gaze. He made that sound again, the untranslatable one. I have not encountered your kind before, he said to me. Humans are common enough, I said. Not this kind, he said. The kind that stands in corridors for reasons that have nothing to do with survival. It is either very stupid or something I do not have a word for. I don't have a word for it either, I said. I just do it. He looked at me for one more moment. Then he turned to Saravith. I will consider what you've said, Nachari. I do not promise that I will accept it, but I will consider. That's all I asked for, she said. He left. The transport moved away from the station, accelerated, disappeared into the deep dark of the outer rim. In the shuttle, the three of us sat in silence for a moment. Then Kale said, "Did that work?" Saravith was quiet for several seconds. "It was a necessary conversation," she said. "Whether it worked depends on what he does in the next 6 months." "What do you think he'll do?" She turned to look at the viewport, at the empty space where the Vaukai transport had been. Something in her expression had the quality of those overlaid maps in her quarters. Layers, time, the weight of knowing many versions of how things could go. "I think," she said slowly, "that he is old enough to recognize when he has encountered something he doesn't fully understand. And old things," she started again. "Old things generally have 2 responses to encountering something they don't understand. They either try to destroy it because the unknown is a threat, or they stop and recalculate." She paused. "I think there is a reasonable chance he will stop and recalculate." "And if he doesn't," I said. "Then he comes back," she said simply, "and we have this conversation again in a more physical register." "You sound unbothered." "I have been having conversations and their physical equivalents for 11,000 years, she said. "I have found that remaining bothered is very tiring and doesn't improve outcomes." She turned away from the viewport. "Take us home, Roke." "Home." She called it home. Valdris Station, with its synthetic coffee and its 60,000 souls and its repaired Eastern grid and its overcrowded refugee processing centers, and its observation platforms where the view never got old, because space was always doing something you hadn't seen before. I took us home. And on the way back, watching the station grow in the viewport from a light to a shape to a familiar collection of structures and platforms and docking rings, I thought about 11,000 years and what it took to still care about a place, to call it home even knowing you'd outlive it. To put yourself between its 60,000 souls and what was coming, not because the coalition asked you to, not because it was your assignment, but because there were things in this universe that were worth protecting, and you happened to be there, and you happened to be you. I thought about Kale standing in that corridor, fighting back to back with my Velhari sergeant. About the wings on his jacket, which I'd learned by then were a Nachari sigil, not decorative, not cultural, meaningful in a way that the full explanation of would take more time than I had right now. About what he'd said in the corridor when I'd finally asked him, "I'm her rider." Not her soldier, not her subordinate, not her protector. Her rider. The person who goes where she goes, who covers the angle she can't cover, who sees the shape of things that the scale of her long life sometimes obscures. 2 kinds of eyes. Neither complete, both necessary. The investigation into the intelligence leak concluded 4 months later. I'm not going to tell you who it was, not in this part of the story. That has its own consequences, its own fallout, and the people involved are still working through the legal process. What I'll say is that Sarevith's plan worked. The false intelligence was specific enough, the channels through which it was fed targeted enough, that when Krampus acted on the information in a way that revealed what he'd been told, the source could be identified. It was closer to home than anyone wanted it to be. It always is. And Krampus, true to Sarevith's prediction, or something like it, did not return to Valdris in those 4 months. Intelligence tracked his fleet to the Herath sector, 30 light-years away. Some activity there, some minor incursions, nothing on the scale of what had been attempted at Valdris. Whether the conversation in the shuttle had anything to do with that, I couldn't say definitively. Sarevith, when I asked her, said, "He is recalculating." Reassuring. "Somewhat," she said. "Old things that recalculate sometimes come to useful conclusions, and sometimes they come to worse ones. We will see which." The last thing I want to tell you about, in this part of the story, is something small. 40 days after the meeting in the shuttle, I was on the Eastern Observation Platform, the same one I'd been standing on when the sky first broke open, with the same terrible synthetic coffee, which had somehow become a ritual I was attached to despite its objective awfulness. Sarevith found me there. She stood at the viewport for a moment, looking out at the debris field where the Dark Army had been. It looked peaceful now. Everything at this distance looked peaceful. "You should sleep," she said, which was her standard conversational opener whenever she found me on this platform at this hour. "Probably," I said, which was my standard response. We stood in silence for a bit. The station hummed around us. "Roke," she said. "Yeah." "What made you do it, the corridor, before I arrived?" I thought about it, the genuine answer, not the easy one. "I didn't decide to," I said finally. "There wasn't a decision. There was just that was where I was, and leaving would have been wrong. In some way I can't be more specific about than that." She was quiet. "Is that the arithmetic thing?" I said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." I looked out at the debris field, at the stars beyond it, at the specific quality of darkness that the deep outer rim had, which was different from other darknesses, more present somehow, like it had been there longer than darkness anywhere else. "You've been watching this region for centuries," I said, "watching it change, watching everything that's happened here. Does it ever," I tried to find the word, "does it ever feel like it matters, after that long?" She thought about it for longer than I expected, really thought about it. "Yes," she said finally, "more than it used to, not less." She paused. "Early in my life I thought that time would dilute things, that the longer I existed, the less each individual moment would weigh. That's not what happens. What happens is, the weight becomes clear. Every moment that matters reveals itself as having always mattered, and the years don't dilute that. They clarify it. So this," I gestured at the viewport, at the station around us, at all of it, "this matters." "Yes," she said, "this matters." We stood in the dark and the hum of the station, and the particular silence of people who have been through something together, and come out the other side still standing, which is its own kind of conversation. The coffee was terrible. I drank it anyway. Outside, the stars did what stars always do, burned their slow, patient fire against the dark, which kept being dark, and had been dark for a long time, and would keep being dark long after everything else changed. But the station's lights were on. And that was enough.